You know, you used to race competitively on four-wheelers. And so, you know, this is just competitive. No, we don't want to do competitive. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. I hope you'll take the questions seriously. And if you have a bulletin, I hope you'll write the answers down. One would be not very important. 10 would be to the highest importance, or to the highest level, if you will. The first question is this: what issues or problems do you feel most compassionate about? Now, the next question is, why these? And then the last question of this particular question, number one, is, why now? And so maybe it's, I feel most compassionate about the fear of being under sedation. I know that's one that Dave said he's working through. It is difficult sometimes for us to think about being sedated. And as Dave said, it's like coming out of a tomb, coming awake after surgery. What is an issue or a problem or problems that you feel most passionate about? Why these or why that one, and why now? Here's question number 2. How would you rate your prayer life? 1 being terrible, 10 being perfect. How would you rate your prayer life? Would you say that maybe question number 2 directly correlates with question number 1? Because if you really feel passionate about it, shouldn't we be praying passionately about it? How about this one? When was your prayer life strongest? How many of us might say it was during those desperate times in my life? During the most difficult times in my life? You see, as some people say, well, I will pray for you. It's the least I can do. If it's the least you can do, it's the least you will do. We don't pray because all of a sudden things get desperate. We pray because we're used to praying, and desperate times come. And it's the first thing that just evokes from our heart and from our mind is prayer. When you get bad news about people you care for very deeply, what's your typical reaction, response, and why? When you get bad news, anybody ever get bad news? You know, I told you that I had the postman come up to my house the other day, had a certified letter. And the only time certified letters have ever come to me, it's never been good. Never been good. And so comes up, I got a certified letter. Oh, no. Need you to sign for it. Oh, okay. Signed for it. Inside was a check for $1,500. If anybody wants to send another one, my address is 1622. When you get sad news, bad news about some people or someone you care deeply, what's your reaction? What's your response, and why? Now, if you were facing a time of trial, a time of hardship, maybe a time of surgery, what would you want your friends and loved ones to do for you? I can remember one time I showed up at a hospital for a lady in our church whose husband was about to have very serious back and neck surgery. I walked into the room, and the first thing the husband said was, "Leave. I don't want you here." Now, so I left the room, but I didn't leave the hospital, because I knew she was going to come back and need somebody to sit with her while her husband had the surgery. And you know, sometimes the one thing somebody may want you to do is leave. Just prior to my mom dying, my father all of a sudden had a fit. And he just said, "Everybody to leave the room, just leave the room. I need everybody to leave the room." And we could have easily said, "No, we have just as much right to be here, right?" No. At that particular time, what did my dad need? He needed the loved ones to do exactly what he wanted them to do at that time. We leave the room, and I went down to work with the people that worked down at social services for a minute. And we no sooner, I mean, not even the distance from here out to the fireside room. Before we got there, her pager went off. She looked at me, shook her head, and my mom had died. Just that fast. And you know what's really strange? Is there are a lot of people who are so private that they won't die in a room full of people. Beloved, that's just true. I've spent too much time in hospitals and too much time being part of hospital staffs. And they will wait till either everybody goes to sleep or everybody leaves or everybody sits down, and then they'll die. It is just astronomically huge in that percentage of people that just don't want to die in front of people. if your loved ones really wanted you to do something, you would say, oh, I really love you, I just won't do that. Now think about that for a second. Now sometimes they ask things that you can't do. You know what I mean? But if they really ask you to do it, and it's a legitimate request, but it's not the one you wanted to hear, and you say no, what have you said to the person you say you love? I don't care about your feelings. This is about me. Now let me also say that before my mom died, she was in the hospital, and she was in intensive care, and my dad could literally only go in there at this particular hospital during certain hours, like between 9 and 10, and then between 11 and 12, and then between 3 and 4. That was all that they would let him go in. And my mom calls me up, and she said, where is your father? It was during that 9 to 10, because my dad was going to be there, and I was going to go to the lunch one. And I found him down at the Tasty Freeze, having breakfast with people, saying this, woe is me, my wife is in the ER, my wife is in the ER, and they were saying, poor boy, oh, I'm so sorry for you. And I walked in and I said, sorry, nothing, get to the hospital. You don't need to be sitting here getting the sympathy from everybody else. You need to be in there giving love to your wife. You see, so many times we turn it from it's all about them to what? It's all about me. It's all about me. Today we're going to start a brand new series where we will find the answers to all of these during our next new series in our Bible teaching. And so I'll be bringing these questions up over and over and over again as we work. We're going to take a look at a book in the Bible that doesn't exist in any other Bibles except for the English Bible. This book does not exist in any other of the Bibles, in any other of the languages other than the English language. Does that surprise anybody? Did you know that there are some books like that? It doesn't show up in any other books. It's never quoted in the New Testament. How many of us would like to study an Old Testament book that doesn't even show up in the Hebrew Bible or the Latin Bible or any of the other Bibles and is never quoted in the New Testament? You would say, well, then it better have a pretty strong main character. The main character only shows up in this book and doesn't show up anyplace else. Pretty obscure. It's almost like studying Ehud. Anybody remember him? Never appears anywhere else, but it's the key book for, I believe, our church for such a time as this. Now, how many of us think, now you know what book I'm talking about? Now I know what book. For such a time as this, it is perfect for Westside Community Church. For such a time as this, you're right, we're going to study the book of Nehemiah. So if you have your Bibles, let's go to the book of Nehemiah. How many of us are surprised that Nehemiah is the answer to all of those things I just said on the previous slide? Nehemiah. We'll study the entire book, so you'll want to tab it. Now, if you have your electronic Bibles, you can tab it real easy. If you have a Bible like Trish's, you can open it up, stick a bulletin in there, and you can find it again real simple that way. But we are going to study it and study it and study it. And how many of us know predominantly it's all about rebuilding the wall around the city of Jerusalem? It's all about give me another brick. If you want a really good book to read, or a good book on Nehemiah, it's written by Chuck Swindoll, and the name of the book is Pass Me Another Brick. And so that's what we're going to talk about. Nehemiah. The name Nehemiah literally means this, God comforts. Now, anytime you see an A-H at the end of a word, it has something to do with Yah or God. Anytime you see an E-L at the end of a word or a name, it is the L name, like El Shaddai or Daniel, Mishiel, Hanariah. Those all have God's name built into the name. So this means Yahweh comforts. Now, if you're going to ask yourself, how do I act during severe times of trying? Why are things bothering me now? When was my prayer life the strongest? How is my prayer life right now? When things happen in my life that are out of my control, how do I respond? When I ask loved ones to do something and they won't do it, how many of us say, oh yeah, God comforted me? I was talking with someone recently, and this is the first thing he said, when things did not go the way he told God they should. Now let me just spell that out again. When things did not go the way he told God they should, he looked at God and said, what's your problem? He even said it out loud. What's your problem? And I said, so did you hear God say, you? Did you hear that back? And how many of us know during those severe times is when he can comfort us the most? Because he has our attention the most. Unless we become hardened in our hearts. You see, God had Pharaoh's attention. But every time God had Pharaoh's attention and God did something Pharaoh didn't like, instead of getting more attention, he got angrier and angrier and angrier at this God of the Jewish people. It says, because God was so at work, it hardened his heart. It hardened his heart to see how loving God was towards his people. He is the famous cupbearer. Now, does anybody know what the job of the cupbearer was back in the Old Testament? Even in some countries today, they were to take whatever the food the king was about to eat, and then they would sample it. If they didn't die on the spot, the king would eat it. And so their job was to potentially commit suicide at every meal. Because guess what? They poisoned a lot of kings back then. And so his job was before every meal to say, I am ready to give my life for you. I am ready to give my life for you. Anybody see the way Jesus prayed over the Lord's Supper? I am ready to give my life for you. As a type, anti-type, even of the cupbearer concept. Because Jesus even said this, may this cup pass from me if there is any other way. But 3 times he prayed, can this cup pass from me? But how did he finish all of those prayers in the garden? I am willing to die. I am willing to die. Not my will, but your will be done. Who becomes the rebuilding manager of the entire city. How many of you have ever done a construction job you were ill-equipped to do? Now remember, he has been living in captivity. Some people would say exile. We'll call it exile for right now. He has been living in exile. What kind of management skills do you think he has as a cupbearer? What kind of building trade skills does he have as a cupbearer? I'm not sure. But I do know this, that if God calls you for a job, he will give you what you need to accomplish the job. Regardless of your past history. So he could take a cupbearer and make him a building superintendent in one day. Because his goal was not necessarily to just build the wall. His goal was to honor God. And God could bring about everything else. He was going to rebuild all of the wall around all of Jerusalem. Wow. In both the Greek Old Testament and sometimes called the LXX or the Septuagint. Now let me just remind us again. Why LXX? Because when they took the Hebrew scriptures and translated them into the Greek, they used 70 scholars. And it was during the time of the Latin period. And during the Latin period, how did they do numbers? So LXX stands for 70. And so it was in direct relation to the 70 scholars that took the Hebrew scriptures and translated them into Greek and Latin. And so we call that particular passage a Septuagint or the 70. And so anytime you see the LXX. But did you know even in the Vulgate, the name of this book is 2nd Ezra. It's not called Nehemiah. Most scholars believe that they were the same book. But in English, we separate Ezra from Nehemiah, and guess what? In many of the Old Testament scrolls, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are all one book. And they believe single unit in Hebrew, all written by Ezra. All written by Ezra. So if we were to examine, and we won't look at all of these passages this morning, chapter 1, chapter 12, chapter 13, these are all first person, Nehemiah. And I believe Ezra sat with it and he said, all right, now let me get this straight. And he took notes. And he took notes as if Nehemiah was writing in first person. He might even have asked him, Carol, would you go ahead and write down your memoirs of this event, and this event, and this event, and then use the memoirs. So Nehemiah could have scribed some of the book of Nehemiah. But who was the editor of Nehemiah? He would use us to lead us into conclude that maybe Nehemiah was the author, but all of scholarship believed that Ezra not only wrote Ezra as one book, but Nehemiah was second Ezra, and Esther would be third Ezra. And yet in the English, we want to be able to know, where can I find it? So instead of just saying, well, we'll find the stories of Esther in the book of Ezra. Isn't it easier to just say, let's go to the book of Esther and Nehemiah? When was it written? Now, the events happened between the fall and in the fall of 446 BC. Now, when you take a look, how many of us know that sometimes in order to find out when things happen, you have to go from one Bible book to another Bible book? And a friend of mine put together a thing called the timeline on the book of Daniel. And let me just go ahead and say it's during the 20th year of the reign of King Artaxerxes. Anybody remember that guy? The last time you took biblical backgrounds and you studied all about King Artaxerxes. And he is the king from 464 to 423 BC. Now remember, we're counting down to zero. So instead of counting up, we're counting down. Pretty long time. And Nehemiah becomes the first governor of the city of Jerusalem post-exile. Now he serves 3 terms. This is possibly during his 3rd term. But he is the governor from 445 to 433 and then all the way for 12 years. Hermeneutics. Let's just talk about this. God stayed true to his word. Now let me just ask, would it help if anybody actually had a timeline that you can just follow along while I'm speaking? If you would like one, Bill, would you be willing to go in the back? Stephen's got them. And if anybody wants one of these, I've got one enough for everybody. So if you would like one, just raise your hand and they will get you one. There will be a test on it next week. Isn't that what everybody says about history? I like history until I have to be tested on it. Now, God stays true to his word, and this is what he promised the children of Israel, that if you wander, I will remove my hedge of authority and protection from around you. And when I do, you will now become vulnerable to anybody and everybody who comes against you. Now, we call it the umbrella protection of God. That means as long as I stay under his umbrella, the elements that are just beating everybody up, falling on everybody else, I'm protected under his banner. His banner over me is love, as it says in the Psalms. His umbrella over me is love. But what happens when his umbrella is here, and I take a look at things out there and I go, ooh. And I run over here and get out from under his umbrella. Does that mean I'm no longer safe? No. But does that mean I'm no longer safe? Yes. Saved? Yes. But no longer safe? No longer safe. And so now, instead of Satan having to going through God, through the cross to get to me, now I expose myself directly to Satan's onslaughts. You see, a Christian can put themselves in a position where he gets between Satan and Jesus, instead of keeping Jesus between Satan and me. The safest place I can be is under his banner, because his banner over me is love. And what is his love? Protection. He protects us. And so his children, that they would have it, and that he would use people to discipline them, but not destroy them. There will always be a root of Jesse. And they will be disciplined if they get out from under that banner. And so will the church. But there will always be a root. Now what does that mean? That he will discipline, but not destroy the people of Israel. And he may discipline, but not destroy the church. And his discipline is good. And guess what? God will sometimes use chosen instruments like the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who were even more evil than the evil of the church. He will even use something more evil than the evil that the believers of his children are doing to wake us back up and to bring us back to him. But unfortunately, during that time period, when things are not going the way I tell God they should, instead of getting back under the umbrella, I take 2 more steps outside the umbrella. In fact, I heard a person say this just recently. When it didn't go my way, I said, fine, God, watch this. And got even in a worse situation. Now, what's the problem with that? If the umbrella of God's care is this chair, and I'm right here, in order to get in this chair, I need to take 1 step. But the further I get from his umbrella, now let me tell you, it only takes 1 prayer to come all the way back. But what does it do to my ego to say that prayer? What does it say to my ego to say that prayer? And you know what prevents us from coming back to God? It's not the things that we've done wrong. It's our ego being willing to admit the things that we to a God, hear me, that already knows. And hear me, already cares. And even yet, already still loves us. Wow. The Assyrians come to the northern kingdom in 722 BC. You can follow it along on your map there. Comes in 722 and defeats the 10 northern tribes of Israel. Now they call their name Israel, and this happens under two different kings of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser number 3 and Sargon number 2. Now how many of us say, oh, I know those names? If you don't know those names, he deports the people and scatters them throughout the entire world. Now the way that he thought that he could, Tiglath-Pileser thought that he could break down people groups is if I took this ethnicity and this ethnicity and forced them to bond with each other. It breaks down your ethnicity. It breaks down your ethnicity. So he deported them all over the world to the point that 750 years later, when Jesus was alive and going through that area, the pure Jew said, I won't step in Israel or Samaria because they're nothing but a bunch of half-breeds. In fact, they would walk all the way to the far side of the Jordan River, go up the eastern bank, and then go over into Galilee. A good Jew wouldn't take a step in the place called Samaria. You can find much of this in 2 Kings chapter 17. During this particular time period, 100 years goes by. Now, how many of us, it's actually more than 100, it's like 112, but 100 years go by. How many of us, that's a pretty long chunk of time, isn't it? For all of you who are more than 100 years old, would you raise your hand right now? But let me just say, 100 years is really not that long of a period of time. When I pastored in Georgia, I talked with people whose grandfather fought in the Civil War and he sat in their lap and told them about it. The church that I pastored was being built in 1861 near Atlanta. What was going on in Atlanta in the 1860s?
Reconstruction.
Sherman and McPherson made a march into the city of Atlanta and burned everything down. And then that one little quadrant that they did not go through, that one little spot is where this church, at the exact same time, was being put up. In fact, there was no processed lumber, and we went into the attic of the church. Guess what we found? Raw tree trunks with still bark on them. That's what they were using for the rafters. So at a time when the whole area around them was burning down, God was building his church. Anybody see any spiritual ramifications? And so 100 years goes by. And during this particular time, Judah should have learned their lessons from Assyria. But instead, they continue to make bad choices, bad kings, bad choices. And finally, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar comes in 605 after Nebuchadnezzar in 609 defeated the Assyrians at the Battle of Carchemish. And during this particular time period, he continues to comes all the way to the city of Jerusalem, ransacks Jerusalem in 605, and takes many of the best and the brightest young people back with him so that they could learn the way of the Babylonians, so that when he deported them again in 597, the people would already come in and see all of their young, bright people all of a sudden worshiping this god called the God of Marduk. And they would say, well, if our youngest and brightest follow this particular God, it's got to be a good God too. And so the king had a big parade, and he set up a great big statue to himself on the plains of Dora. And when they walked in, they were bringing people from 597 to come into the city of Babylon, which is what today? Baghdad, Iraq. And so as they came in and they heard the sounds of the harp and the lyre, they were supposed to fall on their face and worship, and all the people in the parade were supposed to say, whoa, if all of our youngest and our brightest and our smartest and our holiest fall down and worship, we should fall down and worship. And there were 3 young men who didn't. Now let's not forget, we're talking probably around 500,000 people in this parade. And 3 young men stood up and stood out. And let's not forget, they're probably about 15 years old. I've heard so many people say, oh, you can't expect a 15-year-old. Oh, really? I find all kinds of stories of young people. How old was David when he killed Goliath? About 12. The Bible said he still had his baby fat. One version of the Bible said he was a ruddish little boy. and he tried on King Saul's armor. And because King Saul was a full-grown man and he was still a little boy, the armor just slopped around on him. The way I like to say it is like a kid in a full-size catcher's gear walking out there to catch baseball. And the shin guards come all the way up to his chest, and the chest protector lays all the way down on the ground, and the face mask is going all over the place. And you remember what David said? I can't fight this. I've had kids say, I can't catch it this, and we'd say, it's for your own protection. What if Saul would have said it's for your own protection? You see, so many times we think that we could send our children into spiritual battle with our armor when they need their own that fits them where they are. And so in 605 all the way down to 586, they continue to come back and come back. You find this in 2 Kings chapter 25. Jeremiah 25:11 says this, by God's grace, he was only going to allow them to be in captivity for 70 years. Now, first of all, how many of us would say, now, wait a second, when bad things happen, am I supposed to say, thank you, it's only going to last 70 years? David, you're going to go to sleep on Tuesday, 70 years from now, Rip Van David is going to wake up and his foot's going to be fine. How many of us would say, oh, yes, it's only going to last 70 years? And yet, isn't that God's grace? Because he could have done what? Could have been 400. Didn't that happen earlier? What happened to Sodom and Gomorrah? What happened to Genesis with the ark? God is justified in what he does. This was grace. It was only 7 years. So when bad things happen to me, how is my prayer life? Before the event, how is my prayer life in the event? There is your big timeline. And so you can take a look all the way from 605 when they deport Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Let's just ask you, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Isn't that their real names? Okay. And it comes all the way down. And in 539 is when Babylon falls. And it falls to the Medes and the Persians. So if we were to take a look at Daniel and say, how many different kings did he rule under? The answer to that is 4. 2 different nations, 4 different kings. There was Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar's son, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. Then we have Cyrus, and we also have Belshazzar, which is his son's grandson. And then we also have Darius. And when Darius and Cyrus decree that it is okay for them to go back and rebuild the temple, in Ezra chapters 1 through 6, they go back and rebuild the temple. But guess what? The walls were down. So every time they would start to rebuild the temple, a guy by the name of Tobias and another guy by the name of Sanballat would come and knock the temple down. So they build during the day and would get knocked down at night. Build during the day and would get knocked down at night. And they said the only way for us to build and keep the temple of God up would be to what? Rebuild the walls. We have got to have some sort of a fortress around us to keep them from coming in every night. Now we know that Cyrus gives this decree in 539 BC. Almost one of the first things that he does, if you look on your paper there, is as soon as they come in and do the cowabunga do. Now, anybody know that that's exactly what they said when they entered the city? Because all of a sudden Belshazzar pulled out some of the things of God and he used them in unholy sacrifices and parties to get drunk with. And all of a sudden a hand showed up and wrote on the wall, and that's where we get that slogan, the handwriting on the wall. And it says, you have been judged, your time is up. And it says that at that particular time, the aqueduct that went into the city was blocked. And the Medes and the Persians went down into the sewer, came up through the sewer, popped out of the sewer, and defeated the city of Jerusalem by saying, "Cowabunga, dude." They were the Ninja Turtles of the Old Testament. Popping out of the sewer. It's strange that I know too much about the Ninja Turtles. Okay, so in 539, plus or minus. Now, it could have been 538, it could have been 539. And we find all of this in Ezra chapter 7 through 17. And then we find out that Ezra leads a second group back again to help rebuild in 458. And Ezra then chronicles his third Esther is also going on. You see, it is not just this and this. Sometimes things happen at the same time. And we call those clusters. Now, the book of Esther actually happens about 50 years after the rebuilding of the wall. When the people of Israel were allowed to go back, and they said, okay, we can go back. Guess what? There were a group of people in Babylon who said, it is so good here, we don't want to leave. And so they just left, and Ezra found herself in the Nuxox period. Why didn't they go back? Didn't Haman try to kill them all? He was not only going to kill them all, he was going to kill them all back in Jerusalem too. He was going to completely eliminate all of the Hebrew people. And yet they continued. Now, historical key facts. Did you know that Daniel's 70 weeks begins with the cry by Syrians to rebuild the temple in 445 BC? And it goes on to say this, that the historical documents found in Egypt called the Elephantine says that Sambal was the governor, Tobias was there, a person that shows up in the Bible we don't know too much about. They say, we can't even believe that this person existed. Guess what? There are all kinds of extra-biblical writings that says Jehoiakim was actually alive and worked during that particular time, and that Nehemiah, when he stopped being governor, Gateway, and a guy by the name of Big Dan became the governor, and guess what? We find it all in, not the Hammurabi codes, but in the Elephantine codes. From Babylon to Egypt to the Bible, and guess what? They all agree. Coincidence? Nehemiah and Malachi are the last two Old Testament prophets. In fact, for the next 400 years, the people will not hear a word from God. Now, in two different ways, they're the last ones to record, and they're the last ones to record times and events. Now, remember, his grace last time was 70 years. But what happened this time? 400 years. How long has America been a country? A little over 200 plus years, is that right? That means for twice the age of America, God was... God does not speak again for 400 years until after the birth of John the Baptizer. Now, he was not a Southern Baptist. And so a lot of times when they say John the Baptist, literally the word means the one who baptized. And so I call him John the Baptizer. But he was not the only one baptizing. There were other religions at that time that would baptize people. Many times baptized them by blood. The word baptized means to be submersed. He's submersed in water. Others were submersed in their own blood. So in other words, they would be laid out and they would be sacrificed to death, and they would be engulfed within their own external blood. And they called that baptism. And then Jesus, we find that in Matthew 1 and Luke 1 and 2. Now, we think about these key historical events. The Jews had not yet experienced the fullness of the promised land. God's covenant promise, there was a remnant, but that's all there was a remnant. Did you realize that the Jews at this particular time as a nation is smaller than the Jews that came out of Egypt? And at this particular time, they not only did not possess the land, they didn't possess anything. They will not possess the land until 1940s. Think about that. This is all happening when? In 600 BC. And they will not possess the land and own it again until 1940s. Wow. The Davidic throne was empty and has stayed empty until the time of Jesus. And then it is only symbolic, spiritual, and not real. There may be a prime minister in Egypt, but no one from the Davidic throne is on it. There is no king of Israel. There is a prime minister. And yet what did God promise? That I will give you a king who will sit on the throne when? Forever. The high priest at this particular time was from the lineage of Eleazar and Phinehas. And God says, I don't want that particular lineage to be my high priest. Everything that was wrong was being counted as right, and everything that was right was being discounted. But God's promise was there will be a new covenant of redemption. They have been awaiting the birth of the Messiah. So the birth and the life and the death and the crucifixion and the resurrection of the Messiah is the Hebrew word that means God's anointed. The Greek word is Christos, which means God's anointed. And so whether you say it in Hebrew, whether you say it in English, it is the Redeemer. And there is only one Redeemer. He is the prophet, he is the priest, he is the lamb, he is the sacrifice, and he is the king, all wrapped up into one. And we find that in Hebrews chapter 7 through 10. Let's bring this all together. What are the issues that you are dealing with right now? Do you think Isaiah had some issues? Do you think Jeremiah had some issues? Do you think Nehemiah had some issues? Do you think the people that were rebuilding the temple had some issues? Do you think Ezra had some issues? And yet, how did they get through them? We'll discover that they prayed. And then they did something. How was their prayer life before? We'll discover that when Artaxerxes and Cyrus looks at Nehemiah and says, "Why are you downcast?" Because you don't go into the king with a sullen look on your face. You're supposed to walk up and say, "Hi, I'm ready to die. Would you like your cup now?" When you're facing hardships, when people don't do what you want them to do, when they don't drive like you want them to drive. I can't drive up and down 152 without looking for you now. Every time I see somebody pulled over by a California Highway Patrol, I look and I pray for that patrol person, and thinking it might be you. And I pray for you as well, and up in Placerville for you as well. And we have a lot of people in the military and in the fires. When I heard about the fires, I immediately prayed for you and Vic and all of your personal friends that were out there fighting those fires. But you know, we're all fighting a fire somewhere. We are all being pulled over somewhere. And we can find the answers to all of our issues in the book of Nehemiah. Now, it is not just because we find it in the book, but it just reminds us again that we need to look for a Nehemiah who can do what? Who can rebuild the wall and restore the faith. But as we look at Nehemiah, aren't we really going to be looking at Jesus Christ as we look at the bricks? And remember that he didn't just rebuild the wall and renew the faith. That Jesus Christ came and built the church, provided. As we prepare right now to take the Lord's Supper, I'm going to ask you if there's anything between you and God where you have wiggled out from underneath the umbrella of his protection. And before we just all of a sudden bring a piece of bread and a cup of juice, wouldn't it be the right thing to do is to go back to him and say, "Father, forgive me. Before I do this in symbolic, may I first of all do the spiritual